going to go ahead and get started on this beautiful spring day. So I hope I can get through this without crying, because my first introduction to AMACHE was, I read an article in the Denver Post early in December offering scholarships to educators to come to this big celebration in 2008. I don't think I'm going to make it. To 2008 on the 20th anniversary of the second Civil Rights Bill. And I thought, what? I've never heard of a second Civil Rights Bill. What is that? So I applied, and amazingly, I actually got a $2,000 scholarship that paid for 3 days, hotel, food, lodging, and all of the conferences, and a bus trip to AMACHE. So I thought, okay, so I looked up AMACHE on the map. I had no idea where it was. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. So I hope that you all will also recognize how significant it is for us in Colorado. And one of the things, I don't know if Bonnie's going to mention this, that afterwards I read a wonderful book, not by a researcher, but still a wonderful book about Ralph Carr, who was the governor at that time, who was about the only decent politician to speak out about what an incredible atrocity this was. And when I took the bike ride to AMACHE, almost all the other people on the bus were either people who had been there or their children or their grandchildren. So it really is a very, very moving topic. But what has been done, thanks to Bonnie and her archaeology students, to preserve the history and the wonderful story. I'm also a gardener, so of course her book speaks enormously to me. But this is probably the 4th time I've heard her speak on this topic, and every time I learn something new. And it's so uplifting. And it's spring, and it's the start of garden season. So I hope that all of you will be equally uplifted. I need to mention that next week, Dr. Sharp is going to talk about the resurrection and Easter for, okay, help me out here. What's the, for progressive Christians? That's one of our One Big Question series. And fortunately, thanks to the incredible technology team that we have, that we should bring breakfast for them every Sunday for all the work they do. That not only will the talk be available right now, live streamed, but also on the YouTube, but also Bonnie's slides. So if you want to look at them a second time, they'll be readily available. And she's very generously brought a 20% or a percent discount. Her book is published by the University of Colorado Press. It's an inspiration about gardening, about AMACHE, about being decent. And of course, they're not here. I brought some sunflowers that are on the coffee table in there. It just all goes together. Being decent, Ukraine, AMACHE, learning from our mistakes. So enjoy.
All right, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure getting to know Judith, and her support of my work is always very appreciated. I'm happy to be here. And I have to say, so the timing of this talk is amazing. Judith actually brought the paper. Today's Gazette has on the front page the discussion about AMACHE becoming Colorado's newest national park. That was just signed just over a week ago. So it's perfect timing, and also that this is the first chance I've gotten to do a book talk in person. All of these other ones have been virtual, so thank you. It's an inspiring place to be able to tell this inspiring story. So I want to start off today with some words that people would rarely associate with sites of incarceration: beauty, hope, community. And yet in the 7 summers of archaeology that I have led at AMACHE, where Japanese Americans were confined during World War II, my crews and I have found so much evidence that these ideals were consistently materialized through gardening. So the backstory to these gardens is one of the sad ironies of American history. So the late 19th and early 20th century was characterized by both a fascination with Japanese design, especially as it was expressed in gardens, and a simultaneous mistrust of Japanese people. It became a status symbol for many non-Asians to have Japanese-style gardens, spaces that drew from thousands of years of aesthetic, horticultural, and religious tradition, or to employ a Japanese gardener. And yet many of these same people likely supported restrictive and racial legislation, like California's 1913 Alien Land Law, which prevented Asian immigrants who were classified through federal law as aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning land in the state. The law was primarily aimed at Japanese farmers who, since the 1880s, had been immigrating to California and other West Coast states. So some of these first generation, or Issei, came from farming families in Japan, and they had skills in the high-yield farming of the Pacific Rim. But they were also joined by others who were pushed into agriculture by anti-Asian unionism and other professional restrictions. So by 1940, 43% of West Coast Japanese were employed in agriculture, and another 26 in agricultural or horticultural related businesses, like produce stands or nurseries. So this is a population who had literally put down their roots in American soil. But Pearl Harbor would change all of that. So in the wake of the attack of the Japanese military in Hawaii on December 1941, we sort of see this fluorescence of racial hysteria. And it led to President Franklin Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066, which allowed the US government to exclude anyone, including citizens, from any area of the US if it was deemed a military necessity. So quickly thereafter, the West Coast was made into one of those exclusion zones for people of Japanese ancestry. And the official justification of this act was to prevent them from aiding the Japanese military during World War II, and yet this was actually against the advice from naval intelligence, who noted that Japanese immigrants who had chosen to make their homes in the US and their citizen children, known as the Nisei, or second generation, were exceptionally loyal to America. And indeed, not a single Japanese American was found to have committed an act of espionage or domestic terrorism during World War II. And those who joined the Army were in the most decorated unit of the war. Instead, as a congressional inquiry in the 1980s concluded from materials that had been declassified, that the real cause of Japanese American internment was, quote, racism, wartime hysteria, and important in light of the, what Judith was saying about the Colorado governor, a failure of political leadership, unquote. Once an exclusion order was posted, evacuees had just 1 week to put their affairs in order. They were allowed to only bring what they could carry, and the decision of what to leave and what to bring was a very difficult one, and I've heard stories about that. And among those stories, they tell us that among those precious belongings were seeds, and it's a practice that we've also found hints of archaeologically. After being forced from their homes, Japanese Americans were first housed in makeshift accommodations in these detention centers, which sprung up nearly overnight in locations up and down the West Coast that, like these fairgrounds in Merced, were never meant to house people. So despite the fact that these assembly centers, which is what the War Relocation Authority called them, were to be inhabited for only a few months, many imprisoned there embarked almost immediately on gardening. After several months at an assembly center, the incarcerees were then removed one more time, taken via train in the summer of 1942 to one of 10 quickly built confinement camps in the interior of the US. So this map shows the extent of the exclusion zone along the western Pacific Rim. And the Japanese American population of this area was about 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were born in the US, and thus citizens, born and raised. This map shows the location of the 10 primary incarceration sites to which the population was sent, with the Colorado one circled. These were managed by a civilian agency, the War Relocation Authority. And the official name of the Colorado camp is the Grenada Relocation Center, named for the small town that's really only 1.5 miles from the camp. But because of that, there was a postal snarl, and so AMACHE became known as AMACHE, named after AMACHE Ocheni Prowers, who lived and died in Prowers County, and a Cheyenne woman whose father was actually killed at Sand Creek, which is only 50 miles away. So it was a very appropriate name for AMACHE to be called, but that's actually its postal designation. So Over 10,000 people would spend at least part of World War II at AMACHE. The first incarcerees came largely from the Central Valley of California, including the residents of 3 big Japanese farming settlements who were just kind of plucked up in a hole and ended up at AMACHE. They were joined by residents of Northern California, many of whom made their living through poultry raising or seasonally harvesting crops. Thousands also came from the Seinan, which is a neighborhood of LA that's home to professionals such as landscapers, truck farms, produce stands, and backyard nurseries. So AMACHE is located in the Arkansas River Valley of Colorado. It's really only about 13 miles from the Kansas border. The central camp area was a square mile enclosed by barbed wire and guarded by armed military. And like all 10 of the camps, it was designed to be self-sufficient so as not to tax a system that was already experiencing food shortages. So this is a time where we're already starting to see that rationing is happening for everyone in the United States. So the entire project area included 10 square miles, mostly pre-existing agricultural facilities that included irrigated fields, a working dairy, and a working cattle ranch. These were staffed by incarcerees like the one you see in the slide here, who were paid a very minimal salary, typically $16 or less per month. The central camp area itself is located on the sandy terrace above the valley floor. And it's minimally productive land that since the 1870s had really primarily been used for grazing cattle. And the native vegetation are the hardy plants like the yucca that's featured in this graphic made by the AMACHE silkscreen shop. And in fact, every one of the trees that you see in that overview photograph does not belong here. It was planted by an incarceree. The camp's semi-arid and windy environment, which tormented AMACHEans used to the California climate. I talked to a woman who, her family after camp moved to Denver, and she said to me, every time the wind blows, I think of camp. You can just imagine like that, just that visceral experience of being out on the high plains. Ironically, that environment has actually served to protect the historic camp landscape after it was closed and the buildings were dismantled in the fall of 1945. So that native sandy soil blew in gently, protecting the camp and its landscape. And so in recognition of its historical significance and its physical integrity, AMACHE was designated first a National Historic Landmark. That was in 2006. And of course, it is on its way to becoming Colorado's newest national park. So I became interested in the possibility of doing research at AMACHE around the time it became a landmark. But before ever going in the field, I reached out to camp survivors and their families and the town of Grenada, who owns the site and who are going to be donating the site for a park. And I want you to just settle on that for a minute, that they're donating this site. This is how much they care about this history. So I wanted to make sure that archaeology would be a welcome intervention. You know, it's a little bit intense to look at other people's trash. And so I wanted to make sure that, that we would be welcome and that the work that we did would build on the knowledge that both communities, the local community of Grenada, as well as the Japanese American community, held about their past. So those consultations yielded amazing stories of life during World War II, and also historic documents that families had kept of their time in AMACHE or living in Grenada during the war. So the upper photograph was found by a Grenada resident, and you can see the beautiful garden. You'll be seeing more pictures of that garden later. And the photograph below was shared with me by George Hirano, who's one of the 5 boys in this family. And he shared not just pictures of the family as they grew up, but also what this garden meant and how he and his brothers had helped his mother dig the garden and water the plants, and how she used the produce to make traditional Japanese pickles, which was a welcome sort of switch from the pretty, especially at the beginning, pretty dismal fare that was offered to them in the mess halls. So part of doing that outreach also set the stage for us to be able to do collaborative archaeology, because the more we talked to people, the more that people said, we'd really like to be involved. And we've been incredibly lucky that every year we've been in the field, we've had AMACHE survivors and their descendants work with us. So after several years of these consultations, we held our first archaeology field school at the site and the associated AMACHE Museum in 2008. And it was the first of 7 summers that we have done at AMACHE, learning through this new kind of model of archaeology, which is a community-engaged work, but also one that was very focused on better understanding the landscape. So we begin each field season by systematically walking. So those crew can almost reach out hand to hand and touch each other. It's intensive, and these crews are scanning for objects on the site surface, so we can create inventories and maps for each documented block. And while surveying, I have my crew specifically look for activity areas that are visible on the surface of the site, especially gardening and landscaping features. So some of them, like the one that's on this slide, utilize the same concrete out of which the barrack foundations were constructed, while others are marked by tree alignments, plants that don't belong there, and stone outlines, as well as many other materials. We document the more complicated of these with hand and scaled drawings, and learning how to do this kind of maps is a really important part of student training, and then those maps become an important document of the site. We don't just do the hand mapping, though. We also use digital maps that we've been creating, and they help us see the larger spatial landscapes at the site, and we also use them to document the location of our excavation units as well as surface finds. So this is an example of one of the digital maps that we've been creating, and they help us, for example, in this one, and I know it's a little hard with the light in here, but I think actually I can do it even better maybe if I use my pointer. My digital laser pointer, there we go. So that's the people who are not here can also see it. So these yellow squares are individual foundations for the buildings that are in each barrack block, which is going to be 12 barracks, a recreation hall, the central bathhouse and laundry facility, and then the mess hall. And hopefully you can see all of these magenta. Those are all gardens. And so they are typically, one of the things, this pattern that we see is that very quickly we saw a sort of front yard, backyard pattern in many of the blocks, although in other blocks, it turns out that they were prioritizing shade over, so then you'd see most of the trees are on the south side, regardless of whether that was where the entrance was. But you can also see where we have gardens in public spaces of the block, and especially along where the mess halls are. So historic photographs also capture what we are finding through our survey, which was both how raw the site was when carceries arrived. It had been bulldozed for construction, so even the few hardy plants that really grow well there were not there to keep holding the sand down. And so again, in a region coming just out of the Dust Bowl, this is a gritty, wind-blown nightmare. And so immediately, incarcerees set about to change that situation. And they didn't just change it, they radically transformed this landscape. So from the outset, I was really interested in how AMACHEans were taking their expertise in growing things, as well as values and aesthetics, and applying them in this totally new environment, which is the high plains of Colorado, and how they were doing that through gardening and landscaping. I was also interested in what the gardens might tell us about connections and strategies, both inside and outside of the camp, in a situation of upheaval and shortage. So the garden features at AMACHE, like those of the other War Relocation Authority camps, fall into 3 types. The most common are entryway gardens that are found near the doorways of barracks that I just showed you on the overall map, but here's a close-up historic photograph of one. These gardens have their roots in the Suboniwa, or courtyard gardens of Japan, these little gardens that you find that people put all around their houses or between different structures in their living spaces. Yet they're also reflective of the front yards that gardeners of Japanese ancestry were creating for their clients and for themselves in the west coast of the US. The second type of garden are those ornamental gardens that are in the common areas of the camp, and they are often, the photograph is of maybe the most spectacular of those, which was near AMACHE Town Hall, and it was something of a showpiece, and it's a kind of miniaturized strolling garden of the kind that you might have encountered in a botanical garden, and it's complete with a little artificial pond and an artificial hill. And both employ rounded river cobble. So where's my little laser pointer again? Oh, it went away. Gosh darn it. There we go. So this is a rounded river cobble that goes all the way around, that comes from the Arkansas River, which is 3 miles to the north of the main camp area. So the final kind of garden at AMACHE are vegetable gardens, which during the war, as you probably know, were called victory gardens, and they called them victory gardens at AMACHE too. So again, they understood that the produce that they grew helped to make support the effort of our troops, because more food could go to the troops and less at home. So beginning in 2008, we've conducted test excavations in dozens of gardens that cover each of these different types. So some of the garden features we can identify using historic photographs like this one, which was taken from the camp's water tower. But others we have just a hint of on the surface of the site. And in both instances, we've employed a technology called ground penetrating radar, or GPR. Prior to excavation. And what it does is it's kind of like sonar, except that it's through the soil. So we have an instrument that sends energy waves down into the soil, and then they bounce back up, and depending on what they encounter, they bounce up at a different rate and with different intensity, and we can use it to actually create subsurface maps before we ever do excavations. So you can see, hopefully in this one, again, this is what we saw on the surface, but we only saw it in the corners. And when we did GPR, we realized that that it was intact and that it was a garden bed and not just a pond, because you can see how the soil on the outside and the soil on the inside look the same. This is a little stepping stone right here. So if the GPR seems promising, as it was in this instance, then we'll follow up with test excavations. And excavations reveal really important details about how gardens were constructed, what was grown in them, and the activities that took place. And we recover information about what was grown in them through systematic soil sampling for seeds, pollen, and other botanical remains. And that's how we discovered that this garden employed transplanted native plants, which is something that we find in many of AMACHE's gardens. And it's a practice that actually has really deep roots in Japanese garden history, and yet it's employed in this very symmetrical garden bed, something that's more associated with a sort of European-style garden. And this hybrid garden, I think, is really reflective of probably the work experience of former LA professional gardeners who lived in this block. There were about a dozen of them. And it's a good reminder that these are, as garden historian Kendall Brown has noted in his work, Japanese-American gardens. So excavation revealed that the walls of the garden bed were made with cinder blocks, and they were carefully split into 4 pieces. So there's a few whole examples around the site, but as used in the garden, they were very deliberately cut and shaped. And because of that, they look like a fairly passable mock basalt. And basalt would have been a kind of gardening material that would have been familiar to the Japanese gardeners of, and the residents of California. And it was, for us, the first time that I got a really good example of the ingenuity and skill of AMACHE's garden designers and how they transformed institutional materials into these beautiful works of art. Other excavated gardens have employed much more traditional Japanese garden design, although again using improvised materials. So in this case, the concrete byproducts of camp construction were used in the place of large stones. It was really hard to get large stones in the Arkansas Valley. But these were surrounded by a layer of gravel from the Arkansas. And the garden yielded only a few plant remains. And so we think it was mostly a kara sansui, or a dry garden of the kind found in Zen Buddhist temples. So I suspect that this was supposed to evoke a seascape where you have islands that are surrounded by a gravel sea. Some amendments, so in addition to documenting garden design, one way that we've really assessed the horticultural expertise that's exhibited at AMACHE's gardens is through testing the soil chemistry against the off-site controls and non-garden areas. And the chemical analysis suggests that in almost every garden strata, there are more useful nutrients and a more balanced pH than in the surrounding soil, which the Soil Conservation Service classifies as overly drained sand. That's it. So some of these amendments have included marine shell, eggshell, fish remains, even iron slag from the blacksmith shop. That was a good day in the lab when we discovered that. Despite the short duration of the occupation and these quickly draining sandy sediments, there remains 80 years later a chemical legacy of care for the soil in a place no one chose to live. Geological sourcing is also, has shown us that many of the garden stones transported to AMACHE didn't just come from the Arkansas River, but they came as far away as the foothills of the Rockies. And I think these are a tangible reminder that the camp was far more porous than most imagine, with people leaving temporarily on work permits or for group activities like Boy Scout campouts, or there was a Bible camp in the foothills near here in Beulah. And I think that that might be where this, this very cool, this quartz right here is only in its structure, it forms in the foothills of the Rockies, and it was not rolled down because it's not eroded in that way. So I think this might have come from Bible camp in Beulah. But what these stones, I think, are, they speak to these sort of landscapes of freedom outside of the camp, and the fact that people were looking for striking natural stones that they would bring back to beautify the camp setting. The results of our pollen analysis have been truly surprising. So I send the soil samples off to my palynologist, and then I wait usually about 6 to 8 months, and then when my email comes, it's like Christmas morning. I'm like, wow, what are we gonna find today? Never know, it's always a surprise. In this garden, in a number of gardens, we've found plants that would be very, very difficult to grow on the high plains. Dogwood, cattail, and this one, canna, which is a tropical plant that is a relative of the ginger and has no business growing near Lamar. It just doesn't. And it's our first evidence from canna came not from an entryway or an ornamental garden, but actually from a vegetable garden. It grew alongside potatoes. And it's evidence that the Victory Gardens at AMACHE held a mixture of culinary and ornamental plants, and that beauty was important in those spaces as well. Most of these gardens were basically made by farmers or people who might have owned a hardware store. They were not experts in Japanese garden design, but they were shaped by traditional philosophy, such as motenai, the idea that reuse is a virtue and waste is a shame. And these images capture how in one garden, broken tile was transformed into paving around a tree, and in another, the one below is actually a broken water pipe that's been turned up, and it looks like a kind of planter, but in fact that's just the natural cuff of a water pipe. A few of the gardens were made by experts, like the gentleman who designed this entryway garden. Before the war, one of them had worked as a gardener for the LA Railway, while the other had owned a cactus nursery. And this feature is a great example of the way that Japanese garden design can be translated in even the most inhospitable settings. So this appears to be an innovative example of the Japanese gardening technique of shike, or borrowed landscape. And so I hope you can see the prickly pear impression right here right there. I often say it takes a Zen state of mind to dig a Zen garden, and I had a student who was he was doing that excavation unit right in front of it, and after 3 days he came up to me and goes, "Bonnie, it's a cactus!" I was like, "Oh my God, it is." By taking a piece of concrete that had been poured onto a prickly pear and then using it in your garden, especially an entryway garden in a wall that you're going to walk by every day, you can evoke that cactus without the danger of actually having to sort of trip over it on a daily basis. And I really love the idea that this really millennial-old technique is being used in the often unlovely material of concrete. So I consider one of my primary tasks as an archaeologist to notice patterns in the material traces of humans' behavior and then try to explain them. And over the course of 7 seasons of archaeological research at AMACHE, one of the most robust patterns is the ubiquity of gardens. In every single block occupied by the Japanese Americans confined at AMACHE, and pretty much every block that they didn't live in but that they spent time in, we have found gardens of different size, composition, and complexity. And there's a lot of answers to the question of why there are so many gardens at AMACHE. And some of them are, pretty sort of common sense, right? Veggies from Victory Gardens add variety to a mess hall diet. Gardens keep grit down in a region only coming out of the Dust Bowl. Evaporation from ponds like the one on this slide would have created little microclimates that were cooler and moister. And fast-growing plants hide shabby institutional architecture that was covered in tar paper. But I think the energy poured into these gardens suggests something deeper at play. And my study of both Japanese garden history and horticultural therapy has convinced me that gardening was ideally suited to help people of Japanese ancestry imprisoned at AMACHE cope with a nearly unlivable situation. They lived in a world where the social ground was constantly shifting. One day they'd been high school students or optometrists, and the next they were prisoners with no idea if or when they might be released. Those who were immigrants were people without a country, while their children were citizens of a country that had turned its back on them. But they had a set of skills honed over generations for bringing harmony to at least one little part of their world, their gardens. So in 2012, we excavated what turned out to be a stunning Japanese-style entryway garden. And one of the reasons that I chose to further investigate it was its primary feature, this garden wall that evokes stone, but again is made of concrete slabs. And just like the other garden where I thought, wait a minute, I think that's a seascape, I walked away one day and I went, it's a mountain range. But it's not just a mountain range, it's really been placed in an interesting spot. Especially because when we excavated there, as you can see, that the wall was right in line with the doorway. And then when we excavated between the wall and the doorway, we came up with this fantastically beautiful cedar walkway. Cedar is not people purchase this with their own money to be able to build this. And then when you walk from the doorway to this wall, then there were stepping stones that went to either side. So by placing this in this way, it meant that every time you either went into your door or out of your door, you had to slow down and be mindful for at least a moment. And that kind of mindfulness, I think we're all starting to realize how important that is to our sort of well-being. It's part of what's built into much Japanese garden design. And this garden helped that happen in a place where I think mindfulness would have been incredibly difficult. I think that to grapple with the AMACHE gardens, or any garden, we really have to think about not just the art, but the act. The physicality of creating and maintaining a garden is yet another of its virtues. And those of you here who, like Judith and I, are gardeners, I'm sure know that. The daily chores of watering and weeding, or seasonal efforts like picking up fallen leaves or harvesting vegetables, are acts that keep a garden in harmony, but they also keep the people doing them in harmony. Physiological studies have shown time and time again that engaging with plants reduces the physical symptoms of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic symptoms, and in that way, the science and the Japanese garden philosophy, as expressed by this first designer of the Zen garden temple, converge in really interesting ways. And taking care of each other. They put their hope. And the picture, I think, that comes from these gardens, they turned an oppressive and beautiful. Not abandon it, but they expressed it. And so I think that's I think we are. And so mind, body, and soul connection are needed more than ever. So I'm going to leave you guys with a recipe for an AMACHE-inspired. And, you know, it's spring. This is big. We've excavated. So that's value is overlooked. Cheap, or it's a wasted space. Heritage, it could be a kind of plant item linked to an ancestral place, and then something that's native, or a stone, for example. COVID, and claimed a broken pot, so you can see the front was cast off on my, and it's very. It's their gardens. I also put those heritage piece. I placed my family that a student what I've shared today I'm so for those of you so if you're interested in off of the of Colorado Press, so you know, give 40%. That should both pending transition. And is and school. Yeah. We're field season. Students, survivors, house. Day, but they choose. Touch. Particularly, you know, our privilege to 18-year-old fish. The amount a little bit of my case.
Decide.
They and from came to that a circle place that and plan. They are her he was then and
You for